We're going to talk today a little bit about nonprofits, the challenges they face in the cyber world. I think it was Magdalena who had said earlier that she had some tax code that you could use to put you to sleep. I'm going to share some things with you that will probably keep you awake at nights. A little bit about us, and Mike, I think, did a nice job giving you a quick introduction. We are primarily in cybersecurity, digital data forensics, what we call litigation intelligence. Many times cases hinge not on necessarily just an email, but who saw that email, when did it get opened, when did it get deleted. We've got a lab full of very talented folks who find that type of information out. We've been in business about 19 years. We're down in Florida. Our clients include everybody from AmLaw 100 agencies, law firms, government agencies, Fortune 50, Fortune 100. All the way down. We also do some work with some we would call ultra high net worth individuals. We're brought in on some celebrity cases. We also do expert testimony work. As Mike had mentioned, we're one of, I think it is 16 now, accredited by the NSA for incident response. A quick show of hands. How many organizations here take credit cards? Anyway? All right, good group, good number. Okay. If you take credit cards, you are contractually bound by some requirements in the fine print known as the PCI requirements, payment card industry. And if you should actually ever have a breach, you may be required to do what's known as a PCI forensic investigation. Unfortunately, there are only 10 companies in the United States right now who are accredited by PCI to do those forensic investigations for Visa, MasterCard, what have you, and we're one of those 10. Hopefully you don't have to call me on one of those. We try to be the folks that are predominantly behind the headlines. We rather not make the headlines ourselves. But every now and again, an industrious reporter manages to figure out who we are and what we've been doing. And a number of the cases the last couple of years have done that. They have made the headlines. We had a case in Ohio a couple of years back where the entire county government was shut down. But I mean, everything. You couldn't pay your water bill. You couldn't pay parking. The court was closed. You couldn't register to vote. The county was essentially closed. And it was really one of the first wide-scale cases of ransomware we had seen. Since then, the amount of ransomware has escalated dramatically. I'd say at this point, we probably get one new ransomware case a day. In some cases, it is still municipalities being shut down. In other cases, it is not-for-profits having all of their information and all of their backups maliciously encrypted. So we see a lot of that. But this gives you a quick overview of the types of things we handle. We see a fair amount of cyber extortion, a little different than ransomware, where the attackers will go in, exfiltrate your data, and then threaten to release your data unless, of course, you pay a fairly hefty extortion tag. We have seen, let's just say, what should have remained confidential commentary regarding donors be released because the extortion demands weren't paid, causing what I would call irreparable harm to an organization. So these threats are very real. In some cases, we deal with nonprofits that are providing, in one case, birth control services to people in countries where that would be considered something that could get those people killed. So the inappropriate access or exfiltration of data can have more than just economic consequences. It can really have life or death consequences in some cases. A few things we can talk about. We tend to talk about numbers a lot. One of the interesting things is that the majority of victims don't know they've been penetrated. I think the number is 76% at this point of victims just don't know it. They find out about it through outside forces. A client will call, a donor will call. In a really bad day, the FBI will give you a visit, and they'll say they found your financial data in a server in a tennis shoe factory in Chechnya. They don't know how it got there, but they can tell you that you probably have a problem and you might want to look into it. And they leave you with their business card, asking you to call them if you figure it out. These are bad days. Another thing we talk about is the time from incident to detection. On average, it takes, it's 195 days, and depending upon who you talk to, you get a slightly different number. But just about everybody's in agreement now in the industry that from the time somebody breaks into your network or gains unauthorized access until the time you become aware of it is 6.5 months. It's an awful long time to be in your file cabinets. Now, another number I'm going to throw out there, and we'll tie this back. The average user only has 5 different sets of credentials. A credential is a username and a password. Well, if you think about your own credentials, many times you're using your email address. In fact, these days, that's pretty common. Well, that means the attackers already know half of the combination to get in. They have the email address. It's pretty easy to find. So when people only use 5 sets of credentials, that means they use that same password over and over and over. Summer 2018 exclamation mark, or Buffy 3200, or whatever it is. And they use those same passwords over and over. Well, what ends up happening is that you'll use those passwords in a soft target, the PTA, the Homeowners Association, something like that. And that information gets extracted. And then the attackers start to try to use that information in more valuable targets. So for instance, does anybody here, don't raise your hands, please. Does anybody here have a password they use for something simple that also is the password to their checking account or to their email? We see this over and over again. It's fairly common. The value of Bitcoin, this becomes important, and we'll talk about that. When I wrote this presentation, it was 6,200 last week. I think it's up to 6,600 today. Bitcoin is the favored currency amongst extortionists and attackers. They like to get paid in Bitcoin. It is a pseudo-anonymous means of getting paid. The blockchain is open to everybody. I can look at a wallet address and know exactly where the money went. I just can't tell you who controls that wallet. So it becomes a bit of a challenge. But Bitcoin has actually fueled, in my mind, cyber extortion and ransomware because it gave the attackers a means to anonymize their crimes. This is an interesting number, but the global damage cost for ransomware they're predicting next year is going to be $11.5 billion. It's a pretty big number. I think that's probably low. And then finally, ransomware attacks occur every 40 seconds. Show of hands, if you want to, really. How many people in this room are with an organization that is aware of having some type of a cyber incident in the last couple of years? Okay. All right. It's good to know. All right, so let's talk about who's attacking. There are individuals who are looking for profit motives, revenge, notoriety. They may be people who have a political or an economic motive against your organization. They may be diametrically opposed to something your organization is trying to achieve. We occasionally see people who pose as security researchers, where basically they're hackers, and they're trying to figure out a way to monetize their activities. And what they'll do is they'll identify a vulnerability, and they'll go to an organization and say, hey, we see that one of your ports is open and we're able to get in. You should pay us and we'll show you how to solve that problem. But at the end of the day, they're really not researchers, but they're just kind of hiding behind that. We see organized crime. And organized crime and nation state attacks, that line has been blurring the last couple of years. We can talk about organizations that steal credentials and sell them on the black market. I can go online right now and I can buy credentials to a server. Give me a city, give me the type of business you'd like us to buy the credentials in, and I can buy high-level administrative credentials in a law firm, a CPA firm, a nonprofit. It costs $12. That's it. What's interesting is when we do those investigations, we find in many cases there are no credentials for sale in a certain country. Well, clearly that ties back to the fact that that country is harboring these particular criminals, and they're using the criminal activity as a means to generate and gather intelligence data. So that nation-state criminal activity thing really has blurred a lot the last couple of years. We talk about hacktivists. You've heard of Anonymous. Many times they are opposed to a political, maybe an environmental initiative, something like that, and they'll go ahead and try to disrupt things. In some cases, they are actually a proxy for a nation state that has different objectives, but they want to take advantage of that organization. So these things tend to get a little complicated. And clearly we see nation states. I think it's a well-known fact that for a number of years, China in particular has mounted a very organized campaign against universities, anybody doing research, anybody amassing intellectual property. And that's always been a challenge. We're seeing that coming out of Russia, a number of countries at this point. So, we talk about attacker objectives. Everybody has different motivations. Some are looking to make money out of it. Some are looking just to embarrass an organization's defacement. In other cases, it's they actually want to physically harm the targets. In some cases, the attackers, remember that number we talked about, 195 days? The attackers are in the environment, and they're using the victim's environment to launch other attacks. They're using it as a proxy, as a springboard, as a way to hide their activities. So we see that in a fair number of cases. We had a case not long ago. They found they had financial data. It was a stock brokerage organization. They had financial data on people that were not their clients sitting on their server. Obviously, they were very concerned. Turns out the attackers were actually using their server to launch attacks against other brokerage organizations. So sometimes you have attacks that are aimed at management. You may have either leaders in your organization or board members in your organization that for one reason or another draw the ire of various groups. And that's another reason for them reaching out. Also, important piece of what we call password collection. As I said earlier, where organizations like the Dog Club will get hacked, they're trying to harvest passwords. And we're going to talk specifically about really, 5 different major areas that we've seen a lot of activity against the nonprofit world. We talk about the concerns. What should nonprofits be worried about? Well, you should probably be worried about a lot of things, but we look at access to members and donors. Critically important. We'll have a case study we'll talk about in a moment that will articulate why that's so important. Intercepting communications. If you are a think tank and you may have former cabinet members amongst your members, you may have active government officials amongst your members. Nation states would like to understand the thinking, the strategy that's being pushed up to the Congress, to the Senate, to the White House. And we're seeing that type of activity. Clearly, you'll have organizations that are opposed to the objectives of your particular group. And they're looking to disrupt that, disrupt the pipeline, disrupt birth control, disrupt any type of thing you could possibly imagine. Intel collection is also big. We recognize now that a lot of the activity is nation state sponsored, either directly or indirectly. And they're just going to basically use it as an intelligence gathering mechanism. And then you have more mundane things like stealing cardholder data. After the Target breach, the average value of a credit card was $1. You could go online and you could buy full pan, name, number, CVC code on the back, expiration, for $1 a piece. That's all it cost. Since then, the value of certain cards has gone up. Some of your donors' cards are much more valuable. American Express Black Card is, Centurion card. It's probably worth $500 or $1,000 on the black market because everybody knows the limits are so high and the bills don't get looked at immediately. Those are your donors. Those are the people that you have to be concerned with. So let's talk about what I consider to be the 5 major threats for nonprofits. Weak credentials. I mentioned that earlier, but that's just the fact that people use simple credentials, things that are easy, and they use the same ones over and over again. Unsecure vendors. The Target breach, which was really a seminal moment, I think, in cybersecurity in the United States, was the result of an air conditioning contractor who had actually gotten penetrated. And that is how they got into Target. It was the vendor. Phishing. I'm sure everybody in the room is aware of phishing incidents, or at least attempted phishing incidents, where someone's either trying to grab your credentials or someone's trying to get you to redirect a check, a payment, something like that, from where it should go to where they like it to go. Clearly, ransomware that we see is in epidemic proportions and remote access vulnerabilities. All right, so starting out, weak credentials. Ahead of the 2016 presidential election, we saw a lot of reconnaissance activity against nonprofits, universities, think tanks that had any political candidates amongst their membership. Well, at one time, the Republican field was 12. Well, those people went to a lot of colleges, went to a lot of universities, belonged to a lot of organizations. And we saw a lot of reconnaissance activities impacting organizations that were linked in one way or another to candidates at national and at state levels. What was interesting was that a lot of these people had those same credentials over and over. So if you were able to grab somebody's credentials from literally the book club, maybe you could get into something much more interesting, like their email account from a think tank. And we actually saw that type of activity occurring. We believe that was most likely nation-state attack. It could have had some criminal element to it. Many times a group of attackers will walk in simultaneously. Once a site is known to have been exploited, the original individuals will go ahead and sell those credentials or share them on the dark web, and you'll have multiple different parties in an organization simultaneously. So it becomes a little more difficult to figure out exactly who's done what and why they're doing it. Unsecure vendors. We had a case, not-for-profit organization, community services by and large. They had local operations. They had I'm sorry, let me run back there. They had thrift stores, I guess you would call them, on a local basis. And they had a POS, a point-of-sale vendor, who was providing credit card readers and services. That credit card vendor, the POS vendor, got breached, and they used the remote access to get into these individual stores. Now, the stores or the organization had certain indemnification from the POS vendor. The problem was the POS vendor was pretty small, and they really couldn't stand up behind that indemnification. They ended up folding up and going out of business. So here you had a not-for-profit organization that had multiple locations. They had a number of cards stolen, exfiltrated from their organization. Those cards were, in fact, used illegally, illegitimately. And you had the payment card brands, Visa, MasterCard, suffering real economic loss, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in the end of the day, the card brands assessed a fine of, I think it was right over $100,000 against this organization. I will say that in the end, their attorneys were able to negotiate that, and the fine went away, but they still incurred a phenomenal cost, all because of the fact that they had a third-party vendor that wasn't secure. Phishing, pretty typical. We'll see a phishing issue come out where the first thing they're trying to do is basically grab credentials. You'll get an email that says, I've got a special package. It's a PDF, and it's too big to send via email, so please click here to unload the PDF. Or you'll get something else that asks you, it's a survey, whatever. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to get you to put your username and password into their form. You don't want to do that. What they'll do is they'll go ahead and they'll get your username and password, and you won't know it. In fact, in some cases, they do what's called a man-in-the-middle attack, where you put your information in, and then it actually drives you to a legitimate place. A lot of times nothing happens. You'll click once, click twice, think there's something wrong, and then just kind of forget about it. Well, the bad guys have got your username and your password, and they're going to go ahead and they're going to log in remotely into your email account, and you're not going to know it. They're going to do it maybe only once. And while they're in, they're going to put a forwarding rule in place. So every email you get will also get sent out to them. They might also put a delete rule in place that says any information that gets bounced back from that particular box gets deleted. So unless your admin is actively going through your Office 365 or Gmail, whatever you're using, on a regular basis looking for these things, you will never find it in 100 years. All right, so now they've got your mail, and the mail is being forwarded to them. And they're looking for a high gain opportunity. Well, in this case, it had to do with a donor who was making a significant contribution to an organization. They saw the email chain going back and forth. At the right time, they jumped in and basically hijacked the dialogue between the donor and the organization, and they had the donor redirect his wire transfer to a different account. Well, I think it was over $200,000. By the time anybody figured out, the money was long gone. So now you have this phenomenally complicated problem. You have a donor who's very upset. He's out 200 grand. You have an organization that didn't get the 200 grand. You have an insurance company who's trying to figure out who's to blame and who should pay for all this. All because somebody didn't catch a phishing challenge and they put their credentials in. This is pretty typical of a phishing message. This was actually a very good one that floated out a little while ago. It had in it some information that would make people think it was legitimate. There was one that actually had their phone number. So if you get an email that says, we're trying to send you a package, and here's your name and here's your phone number, people think, well, it must be legit. They have my phone number. There was one last year that looked like it was a FedEx package, and the notification had your social security number in it. Wow. People looked at that and thought that must be legitimate. Nobody's really stopped to think, why would FedEx have my social? That doesn't make any sense. But a lot of people fell for this, and they logged in and they gave away their username and their password. Ransomware is certainly a large item. And as I said, we see so much of it. We're probably seeing one ransomware case a day at this point. They are going anywhere from half a Bitcoin to, I had a case last week, the demand was $350,000. It's actually very hard to get 50 Bitcoins in one piece because of some of the currency controls and what have you, banking, Patriot Act issues. You can't just go in and buy $350,000 worth of Bitcoins. It's a bit of a challenge. In this particular case, we usually are able to negotiate with the attackers. And in this particular case, we went back and we said, hey, $350,000 is just impossible. This organization can't pay that. They came back and had copies of the financials of the organization. They knew exactly who it was. And they were like, it's a rounding error for these people. They can pay it. So I still don't know how that's resolved. As of when I left yesterday to fly out, the client, the FBI, and the insurance company were still going in a circle to see how that was going to resolve itself. But pretty typical ransomware. Someone clicks on a malicious link, malware encrypts local files. In many cases, it'll also go ahead and spread to map drives. So, if you go ahead and get ransomware on your laptop, on your desktop, it'll get everything on your C drive. You then map to a file server, something like that. It'll go ahead and start encrypting all that. Depending upon how you're configured, it can encrypt your backups. Now you have a problem because backups are the solution everybody thinks they have if they lose their data. It's really it's a hugely problematic issue. In many cases, the only option is to pay the attackers. Your data is gone if you're not properly configured, not properly secured in terms of your backups. We had a case of a small not-for-profit. They provided services to children with special needs. They had an insurance program that really wasn't the best insurance program. They had a $5,000 limit to their cyber coverage and extortion. Doesn't even scratch the surface. Folks called us and they were out of business. They were going to be done. They were a small organization. They had a server set up. They had an external hard drive plugged in as their backup solution. And everything they had was just encrypted. They were out of business. And we were able to work with them. And in this case, they got lucky. We were able to get the extortion demand down from $100,000 to $10,000. Basically said to the attackers, you're not going to get anything. These people are just going to go out of business. It's going to be done. And they're greedy, so they decide to take something instead of take nothing. But we see this on a daily basis. I can't stress this enough, how critically important it is. You'll see a screen like this when you get hit with ransomware. It'll tell you the FBI locked your system. The FBI didn't do anything. Or you'll see an extortion note. Many times they actually admonish the people for not having better cyber hygiene. I mean, the gall is kind of amazing. But it's just something to be aware of. The other thing I should mention, the ransomware scenario is so typical. let me just take a minute to drill down on it. The IT team, in many cases, makes the problem worse. I love IT guys. They make my job a lot easier, really. And without them, we wouldn't be able to do 90% of the things that we do. But there's a scenario with ransomware that basically says you walk in and you can't open your files. Okay. You call for IT folks for help and they come out and say, yeah, they run antivirus, they found the malware, and they have great backups, and this is super. They're going to go ahead and they're going to basically wipe out your computers, put new images in of your operating system, all your programs, and restore your data from backup. That's great. But what they've done, they've destroyed all your evidence. One of the things to think about is, depending upon the kind of information your organization holds, you may have legal requirements to notify impacted parties if there's an unauthorized access or exfiltration of data. So for instance, if you provide any type of medical services, if you provide services to children with special needs, if you have anything that could be even vaguely characterized as PHI, protected health information, and you have a ransomware incident, you need to determine whether or not anybody actually looked at that data or did they just encrypt it. Well, if the IT folks came in and did a great job and got you back and running and didn't preserve anything before they flattened the boxes, you now have no way of knowing. All your evidence is gone. And while I'm not a member of the bar, I would argue that most attorneys would then say to you, since you can't prove it didn't happen, you need to err on the side of caution and notify all the people that may be potentially impacted. And that can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Fifth case, remote access. We had a reasonable size nonprofit organization which had a very dynamic executive director. And he really wanted to do a lot of things. He jumped into the job feet first, and he was working literally all the time. Nights, weekends, on the road, constantly working. Great guy, trying really hard. The challenge was he set up remote desktop protocol, RDP, which a lot of organizations still use. He didn't have any two-factor authentication on, but he was able to go ahead and remote into his computer when he was on the road. Unfortunately, the bad guys figured that out too. And what ended up happening was they managed to figure out what his password was. He did not have two-factor authentication in place. Didn't have anything to lock them out. There's things like we call RDP guard. If you try 3 times or 5 times, however you set it, and you don't use the right combination of passwords, it will lock you out from being able to continue to brute force, make that attack attempt. But they didn't have that in this particular organization. Managed to access the server. They had a lot of healthcare information. And the attacker was in for a substantial period of time. We could not determine exactly what the attackers looked for or looked at, but we did see that they were in for weeks. And legal counsel finally came in and said, the folks were in on multiple occasions for weeks. We see what folders they went to. We couldn't see what they did in those folders. The attorneys advised the organization to go ahead and notify. And they had to notify maybe 6,000 or 7,000 people. So let's talk a little bit. I tell you all the bad things. Now let's talk about some of the good things. What can you do? All right. In security, we talk about effective solutions as being layered. It's not one thing. Antivirus stops less than 30% of the malware that's out there right now. So it's clearly not antivirus, and it's not just patching, and it's not just having good credentials and good cyber hygiene. It's all these things. You have to really have a very layered, a multi-dynamic approach to go ahead and address your cybersecurity issues. But the most important thing to start with is to identify your assets. Not all assets are equally as valuable. I would argue in an organization, you could have 2 computers. One is basically the surveillance tape of the parking lot, and the other is the laptop that belongs to the lady who runs HR. Now, I would argue, without knowing anything more, that the HR laptop is far more valuable to you than the machine that has the video of the parking lot. Yet most organizations don't really understand that. They don't develop a cyber strategy that takes that into account. All assets are not equally as valuable. The first thing is to identify your assets. Know what you have, know what's important. One of my colleagues in the back of the room, he's going to laugh when I start to say this, but I have a theory that says that cyber information is more like milk than it is wine. It doesn't get better with age. It becomes a liability. It becomes a mess. Yet organizations continue to keep years and years and years worth of information on servers that they will really never have a practical need to use, yet they create this hysterical liability. We had a case, not a nonprofit, we had a case of an attorney. He had 30 years of closing documents on house transactions, buying, selling, mortgage apps, 30 years on this giant multi-terabyte server. And he was so proud of himself until he got breached. And then he had to reach back to clients he hadn't spoken to in 30 years to tell them his information, their information had gotten out of his system. He decided to fold up his practice. He retired after that. That was the end for him. But getting back, identify assets, incredibly important. Define risk. Risks are different for different organizations. Risk tolerance is different. It's very important to understand what your risks in your organization are. And I'll touch on that in greater detail in a second. Make sure you have the basic safeguards in place. Antivirus, patching, logging. Logging is simply just recording the activities that are occurring on various devices in your network. So for instance, when somebody basically signs on remotely, that should create an entry in a log file somewhere. And you should know what credential was used and where they came in from, the IP address that they used. It's like having surveillance tapes. Organizations create the digital equivalent of having surveillance video cameras, but they don't keep the tapes. They don't keep the logs. Logging is crucially important, especially to even small organizations. The other thing that's important is you have all these tools. Is anybody looking at them? You know, if you're not updating your antivirus, updating your patches, making sure people are looking at logs, analyzing your data, you're really waiting to get that call from the FBI that says they found your stuff in that tennis shoe factory. Situational awareness, that's a fancy word for saying your people need to pay attention. They need to be mindful when they get something that doesn't pass what I call the smell test. If you get an email that doesn't look right, it's probably not right. Ask a question. One of the big things we're encouraging people across all industries to do is before you send money, pick up the phone and call the person who's asking you to send money and say, did you really mean for me to send $100,000 here? Confirm that. Because what we're seeing is that is the best solution to prevent against somebody actually doing a business email compromise, redirecting and hijacking a conversation, and stealing your money. It's simple. But the cycle is a perpetual cycle. Cybersecurity is not one and done. Someone here earlier today said to me, it's like you don't just do one audit and say, okay, we're done, never have to do that again. It's continual. The landscape changes. The operating environment changes. So we see it as a continual process. Identifying assets, assess the risk, make sure you have proper safeguards in place, respond to incidents because you will have incidents, adjust, improve, and then continue. Identify the assets. The organization is not static. A key element most organizations should do and don't do is what we call a cyber risk assessment. We identify risk as basically being comprised of really three different elements: of threat, of vulnerability, and of impact. The threat is how badly are the attackers mounting ransomware campaigns. You have no control over the threat. We have a pretty good idea what the threat is because we see it across hundreds, thousands of organizations. But the threat is basically the hostility of the operating environment that you're forced to work within. Vulnerability is different and unique for every organization. How good are your passwords? How well trained are your people? How good is your logging? It's all the nuts and bolts, the pieces. Finally, impact is just as we said before. Is it the HR machine or is it the parking lot video surveillance? What's the impact? Will we have a problem if this data gets out? Will we have a problem if we can never see this data again? Understanding impact. And by combining those three of threat, vulnerability, and impact, we come up basically with risk. And I don't think we're dissimilar from many other organizations in our space that approach things the same way. But I think it's important to understand the tolerance for risk will vary with every organization. It's a key element. Can I take any questions? Mike?
So, I don't know if there's a microphone, but maybe you can just repeat my question.
Yeah, sure.
What's the, I know you often have a prescription. You're talking a lot about reaction to events.
Yeah.
Let's talk about proactivity. So for those folks out here, I know my firm does a lot of proactive things. Like I was telling Jeff jokingly that our partner in charge of our technology group oftentimes will send out emails that are not real to see who clicks on the links, and then they go into the penalty box, and they have to get taught remediation. So I jokingly said to Jeff that I don't even read her emails anymore. I just delete them. So, but in any event, what do you do in terms of telling organizations? Because I saw hands raised that had some sort of penetration issues. I saw a lot of hands that didn't get raised. So what should they be thinking about in terms of staying a healthy patient?
Yeah, it's a good point, Mike. Thanks. As we talk about understanding your risk, that's really what it gets down to. It's understanding your landscape of what are the threats impacting you, what are your vulnerabilities. It's assessing your situation, and you can't do it piecemeal. You can't say, well, the last year we went ahead and we put an antivirus in, and this year we have a new patching solution, and you really need to look at it from the totality. I would, I guess, make the analogy. It's a lot like going through a financial audit. Where are we deficient? Where do we have gaps? And identifying what those gaps are, so you can start to close them. And I think one of the key elements, somebody in your organization should be made responsible for the overall cybersecurity of your organization. And that's probably one of the first ways to start, is charge somebody with that responsibility so that it gets focused. Because what we see happen many times is it becomes, it's something in committee. The board directors will get together and say, yeah, we should do something about that. And the next quarterly meeting, they say, yeah, we really should do something about that. One of my partners is retired Brigadier General Charles Shug. Charlie was a Top Gun fighter. He's the real deal. 500 combat hours flying F-15s. And Charlie does a war games seminar, basically an exercise for boards of directors. And he scares the heck out of people. He really does. He starts out with a scenario that goes, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, you're in your car on your way to work, and you get a call from one of your people that something just went offline. And then at 9 o'clock, you get another call that another facility someplace else in the country has gone dark and they can't get any of your data. And at 9:30, CNN is on the phone and they like to chat with you. And at 10 o'clock, the Securities and Exchange Commission has suspended trading in your stock. And he really scares the heck out of people. I mean, he really does. But it gets down to that point. There's a lot of talk at the board level of what to do, yet it's not really becoming actionable until you make it one person's responsibility, or multiple people, but you have to give somebody charge with, we're going to tackle this. That's the first step. Yes, sir.
You mentioned unsecure vendors. So can I ask what kind of specific suggestions, protocols you have about unsecure vendors, particularly the cloud vendors like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, that have so much confidential information on their servers?
Yeah. Excellent question. Thank you. Most of the larger cloud vendors are able to provide very secure environments. Whether or not those environments are properly configured and whether or not they're properly addressed is really the challenge. It's not uncommon for us to come into an investigation, let's say with an e-commerce site. All right. And the e-commerce site talks about how they're PCI compliant and they provide all these services. But if the organization hasn't bought those services, for instance, file integrity monitoring, I'm getting in the weeds here, but file integrity monitoring on an e-commerce site would be the number one way to see if anybody's changed your code that would allow them to scrape credit cards off the system. It's an option. You can get it from almost everybody, but nobody offers it as part of the overall package. So I think one of the elements there is, if you're contracting directly with Amazon, well, hopefully you have IT people in the organization that are able to look at those things with you. And Amazon does a good job consulting. You can get their time. Any of the large cloud providers have great organizations that can help that. But if you're working through a third party who is in turn using Amazon, that becomes a little more complicated. You need to really ask them, what have they done to protect your data? And if they say to you, well, Amazon, the cloud is protected, that's not good enough. We know they can do that, but specifically, what is the third party doing to make certain your data is secure? And it gets back to all the technical features about access controls and logging and multi-factor authentication and those types of things. So, yes, sir.
We allow access to our computers in the computer world that we never would have allowed in the paper world.
Oh, I think it's an excellent point. I think we do. I think we have a culture right now in general that is happy to trade information for access. And if you think about it, when you go onto Google and you look for something, that search engine is free, but you're giving them a lot of information about you. You look at social media. I got a late start in life. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and she keeps me up every single night. The stuff she puts on social media is downright scary, but they trade that. We've created a culture where we're willing to give away information in return for getting access to things. I think we would never agree to let people come in and rummage through our file cabinets.
That's the same thing with the vendor. We're allowing the vendors into a really file cabinet.
Yep.
Physical cabinet. We never would allow that to happen.
Yeah, and there's two different ways to address that. One is you could say, okay, we're going to have risk transference. Those of you in the healthcare world appreciate what they call BAA, Business Associate Agreement. And basically it says if I have any PHI that I'm putting out to a third party, that third party has to be bound by the same obligations I am, and they're going to indemnify me if in fact they drop the ball and something gets out. Well, if you're a big hospital or a big organization and they have a big breach, that's great. Everybody's insurance will kick in. But if you have a small vendor, like one of the ones we talked about, who really can't indemnify anybody because they're so small they really couldn't stand up. If they had a claim, they wouldn't be able to pay it. Well, then what do you do? So it's not even about risk transference at that point. It's sort of like the bell has been rung, the damage has been done, and you can't unwind the damage. And those are the challenges, the reputational damages, that type of thing. So yeah, I think it's a huge issue. I think organizations need to be mindful of who they're letting in their organization. Let me ask this, just curiosity, to run that down a little further. How many of your organizations use an outside third-party IT provider? Okay, all right, pretty good number, all right. One of the things I would suggest in that scenario is have them tell you what are they doing. If they have remote access into your network, and they probably do, I'd ask, do they use two-factor authentication? So it's not just enough that they go ahead and they have a password to get in using something like TeamViewer, but they also have to have a token going to a phone. It reduces the possibility that it's a fraudster and makes it more likely that it's the person who should be getting in. The other thing they should be looking at doing is doing what we call IP limiting, so that they can only get in from a particular IP address. Clearly, your IT people should not be coming in from Uzbekistan. I mean, or Lagos, Nigeria, any of those places. So, those are just two of the simple things you can do to try to make certain that your IT vendor is basically not letting anybody into the files. Sure.
Use the microphone. Online.
Most of our sensitive information is on cloud services.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the contracts, they say we follow industry standard practices for protecting. What kind of practices should we be looking for, or standards?
You want to have controlled access first and foremost. You want to have the access limited. In some cases, it's difficult. I mean, it depends on the specifics of how that data needs to be accessed. For instance, if you're hosting something at Amazon and the whole world is hitting that database, you can't turn around and say, okay, I'm going to basically geofence it so nobody from China can get in. It's not a workable solution. So it really depends on how you're using the data will dictate how you can best protect the data. And I know it's a bit of a broad answer, but case in point, you should be making certain that there's logging going on against that access. So every time anybody either attempts to or actually accesses the data, that's recorded. But then you also need to have somebody who's looking at those logs to make sure there's not reconnaissance activity that you can detect in advance, hopefully, of someone trying to get in before they actually do.
So Jeff, one question coming from an auditor. So one of the things that we are required to do one of the things that we're required to do is, in many instances, get what are called SOC 1 reports, Service Organization Control reports. Basically, for those in the audience, these are some degree of affirmation coming from an independent accounting firm that the service provider, ADP or some other provider, has reasonable internal controls. So I would think that folks in the audience, when you're dealing with smaller vendors, if you ask that simple question, do you have a SOC 1, SOC 2 type report, and they say, I don't even know what that is, you might want to consider changing vendors, because you want some degree. Amazon, we know, is generally the Fort Knox of the world of the cloud. We get it, but when you're dealing with other ones, and your thrift store situation was a very interesting one, because they're relying on the integrity of a system that has not been checked by anybody other than a contract says, you know, we're good to go. So I think everybody should think about, you always wait. I shouldn't say you. In many instances, our clients wait for us to ask for the SOC 1 reports. And we know ADP is a known quantity, and this one's a known, but there are other ones that, you know, you really should be asking about, because they're the ones that when they say, well, I don't even know what that is, you should really scratch your head and think about whether you should use it or not.
That's a good point. Any of your third-party IT vendors should be able to demonstrate to you that they've had access controls in place, so that they are using multi-factor authentication. They're limiting the access from certain IP addresses. They're logging everything that's happening across into your network. And if they can't answer those three basic concepts, they're probably not the right organization. So, all right, well, good. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time this afternoon.